Hey guys, tonight we drift into a city wrapped in frost, cobblestone streets slick with ice, and carriages creaking as they roll past lanterns glowing in the mist. It's Vienna, December of 1791, and you've wandered into a chapter of history that feels both intimate and monumental. The music capital of Europe hums with gossip and candlelight. But somewhere in the maze of streets, one man's story is drawing toward its final chords. That man is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and you're about to sit by his side in the weeks before his death. Illness, mystery, suspicion, and all the whispers that have tangled around it for more than 2 centuries. Before we slip further into his world, here's a little reminder. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd also love to know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge down a narrow lane, boots crunching in the packed snow, breath clouding the night air. The city feels alive and yet hushed, like a theater waiting for the curtain to rise. Vienna in 1791 isn't just any city, it's the beating heart of music. Operas, chamber concerts, symphonies, the nobility and the rising bourgeoisie all want to be seen near a harpsichord or inside a theater box. And yet, beneath that glitter, there's something darker. The disease lurks in the damp corners. Money problems gnaw at even the most famous performers. Mozart, at this moment, isn't the golden boy everyone imagines when they hear his name today. He's 40-something, 35, to be precise, already ancient for his century. And he's tired. You picture him hunched in a heavy coat, rushing across the square, clutching his manuscript pages against the cold, still working, still chasing deadlines, even as his body begins to betray him. The mainstream historical fact here: by December 1791, Mozart is ill, confined to his bed, with swelling in his limbs and fever shaking him. We know this from letters and eyewitness notes. The quirky detail: the man still dictates music between shivers, claiming he hears entire movements of his Requiem in his head, like a ghost orchestra only he can conduct. And here's the scholarly debate that hovers even now. Historians still argue whether the cold Viennese winter worsened his condition, or whether his decline had nothing to do with weather at all. You keep walking, pulled deeper into the cityscape. Horses clop by, leaving plumes of steam in the night. Somewhere, a violinist plays in a tavern, bow scraping through a dance tune that sounds both cheerful and a little tipsy. Vienna has that duality: grandeur in the palaces, rowdiness in the beer halls. And Mozart, the so-called prodigy, is stuck in between. He's no aristocrat with a castle. He's not a scrappy street fiddler either. He's middle ground, which in the 1790s often meant financial instability. Imagine stepping inside his modest apartment on Rauhensteingasse. Narrow stairs, creaky wooden floors, fireplaces that never seem to warm enough. The house smells of wax and broth, not perfume. You hear Constanze, his wife, pacing, worried. You hear the muffled cough from Mozart's room. This isn't the palatial setting of a legend. It's the cramped reality of a working musician who lived commission to commission. But outside, the city keeps moving. Coffee houses buzz with heated chatter. Some gossip about the emperor. Others argue whether Haydn is still the master of symphonies. And tucked in these conversations, a rumor begins. Have you heard Mozart is dying? One man swears he saw the composer, pale as chalk, last week. Another insists he's cursed, having written his own funeral music. Gossip moves faster than carriages here. You pause at the edge of St. Stephen's Cathedral, its Gothic spire piercing the icy fog. The bells toll, echoing through the square. Religion saturates daily life. Masses, baptisms, confessions. Mozart himself has been busy with sacred music, though the irony isn't lost on anyone that he's composing a requiem while wasting away. You might smirk at the melodrama, but to the Viennese, it feels like divine foreshadowing. Inside the cathedral, candles flicker against stone. The organ moans low chords. You can almost imagine Mozart slipping in to hear it, closing his eyes, letting the harmonies mix with his fever dreams. He once said that music was the expression of the soul. And here, in these final weeks, you sense his soul stretching thin, clinging to sound even as the body weakens. Mainstream fact. Again, Mozart conducted the premiere of The Magic Flute just weeks before falling seriously ill. The quirky tidbit: audiences loved the comic bird-catcher character, Papageno, so much that Mozart himself sometimes jumped on stage to play the bells backstage, giggling as if he were part of the joke. Debate: was the strain of working on the magic flute, rushing through rehearsals and performances, the trigger that pushed his fragile health over the edge? Some historians say yes, others shake their heads. He was always frail, always sickly, and this winter was simply the end of a long pattern. Back in the streets, your feet slip a little on the ice, and you catch yourself on a wooden post. A man passes, carrying a basket of bread. Another, with sausages steaming in the chill. Vienna smells of yeast, smoke, and horse dung. But there's also chestnuts roasting at street corners. The sensory mix is confusing, but comforting. Like life itself. You wander past the theater district, the place where audiences still hum arias from Don Giovanni. Picture some young student whistling a phrase of Mozart's music as he hurries to class. That's the paradox. While the man himself is fading behind closed shutters, his melodies spill into the air, unstoppable, almost mocking the fragility of flesh. And here comes your first light joke. You can't help noticing that Vienna's version of going viral isn't TikTok dances. It's people literally coughing in cafes. If you didn't catch an area, you probably caught the flu. Inside Mozart's circle, the awareness of his decline grows. Constanze is anxious, trying to keep visitors from tiring him, trying to manage their debts. You can almost see the stack of unpaid bills on the table, mocking her. They're not the glamorous family one imagines from genius tales. They're scraping by, selling jewelry, begging for advances from publishers. And yet, in the midst of this, there's music, pages of notes pouring out, dictated even from bed. The mainstream detail: the Requiem Mass was commissioned anonymously by Count Wolfgang, who intended to pass it off as his own composition. The quirky detail: Wolfgang had a habit of commissioning music under secrecy, like some 18th century ghostwriter enthusiast. The debate: did Mozart know the commissioner's identity? Or did he truly believe he was writing a mass for himself? As Constanze later claimed, as the winter deepens, you picture Vienna lit up for Advent. Markets bustle with spiced wine, candied almonds, little nativity figurines. Children chase each other in wool coats. But inside Rauhensteingasse, the soundscape is quieter. Murmured voices, groans, the scratch of quills on parchment. It feels like two worlds, the joyous season outside and the hushed vigil inside. And so, you linger here, standing on that threshold between city and sick room, between celebration and decline. You feel the contradiction of it all. Vienna at its cultural peak, Mozart at his personal nadir. It's a contrast that history loves to exaggerate. But tonight, you're living it step by step, lantern by lantern, cough by cough. Your second light joke drifts in naturally. You might think, Vienna in 1791, what a romantic place to spend Christmas. But then, you remember no indoor plumbing, chamber pots dumped in the street, and the occasional rat running past the bakery. Romance, sure. Just watch your shoes. Time stretches strangely. Days feel short under the weak sun, but nights feel endless. Mozart's friends drop in. Süssmayr, Stadler, maybe a pupil or two. Some bring encouragement, others just bring news of concerts or payments. You sense their awkwardness. How do you cheer a man who looks convinced his own funeral music is nearly due? Here's your third light joke, whispered under your breath. One friend apparently suggested chicken soup for him, because even in the 1790s, when in doubt, yep, chicken soup. Medicine evolves, but comfort food is eternal. And so Vienna, winter 1791, becomes more than just a setting. It becomes a character itself. The snow-laden rooftops pressing down, the flicker of candles in drafty rooms, the whispers in smoky cafes. You walk its streets as though you're part of the unfolding drama, sensing the curtain about to fall on a life too brilliant, too brief, too riddled with questions. The mainstream fact you carry out of this section: Mozart really did fall ill and decline rapidly in December, never to rise again. The quirky image, him laughing backstage while playing Papagenos bells, weeks before collapsing into bed. And the lingering debate: was it exhaustion, illness, or a darker cause, hiding in the city's shadows? For now, you let the scene freeze around you. Vienna in midwinter, a city alive with music and rumor, unaware that within days, one of its brightest lights will dim forever. You're still standing in that dim Viennese street, lantern light flickering off the frozen cobbles, when the cough from upstairs grows sharper. The door creaks, and you slip inside Mozart's narrow lodging again. The air is heavy, with the scent of tallow candles and damp wood. And the first thing you notice is the temperature. It's colder in here than outside. The fireplace sputters, offering more smoke than warmth. And the draft snakes through the gaps in the shutters. Mozart lies in bed, cheeks flushed, eyes restless. A fever has taken hold. His forehead glistens with sweat, yet his hands tremble as though he's been dunked in snow. You can almost hear his heartbeat echoing in the silence of the room, erratic and unnerving. This isn't the sniffles. This is something serious, something with weight. mainstream historical fact. Eyewitnesses recorded Mozart's rapid decline starting around late November with fever, swelling in the limbs, and profound weakness. The quirky tidbit: despite these symptoms, he continued to hum melodies, even insisting on singing choral parts of his unfinished Requiem to friends at his bedside. And here's the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether his fever was the mark of a common epidemic disease sweeping through Vienna, or whether it pointed to something uniquely sinister in his case. You drag a chair closer to his bedside, the wooden legs screeching faintly against the floorboards. He turns his head, mutters something you can't quite catch, then suddenly blurts out a passage of music, Latin words tangled with half-sung notes. He's rehearsing with ghosts. You glance at Constanze, hovering in the corner. She wrings her hands, worry carving lines into her young face. She's seen Mozart sick before, but this feels different. He won't let go of the score, even as his hands shake too much to write. So she props up the sheets, fetches ink, and calls in his pupil, Franz Xaver Süssmayr, to help transcribe. Imagine the scene: feverish genius, dictating bars of music between bouts of nausea, the ink blotting where a coughing fit interrupts. Outside, the clamor of carriages carries on, oblivious. But inside, everything is muted, suspended. Now, lean in closer to the fever itself. In 18th century Vienna, fevers were a terrifyingly common fate. No antibiotics, no modern understanding of germs. Physicians classified illness in vague terms: putrid fever, dropsy, consumption. For the average person, it was a coin toss whether you recovered or were carried to the churchyard. And Mozart, despite his fame, was no exception. Here's your first light joke of this section. Doctors back then might recommend bloodletting, mustard plasters, or drinking medicated wine. Honestly, if your physician prescribes more wine as treatment, either he's very Viennese or just trying to join the party. You watch as the fever escalates. His skin alternates between burning hot and frighteningly cold. His ankles and hands puff with edema, the swelling that made some friends whisper later that he'd been poisoned. He mutters about unfinished notes, about the lacrimosa, about the mass he's convinced he's writing for himself. Constanze begs him not to speak like that, but he only smiles faintly, too tired to argue. The mainstream anchor here. Reports from his family and students mention that Mozart himself believed he was dying, certain that the Requiem was his own funeral music. The quirky aside, he insisted on correcting Süssmayr even mid-delirium, snapping about wrong notes while sweating through the sheets. The debate that lingers: was this prophetic self-awareness just dramatic imagination, or did he know something others didn't? Meanwhile, news trickles through Vienna's coffee houses. Mozart is bedridden. Some shrug. After all, artists are always a bit dramatic. Others gasp, remembering his recent triumph with the magic flute. Surely he'll bounce back, they say. But not everyone is optimistic. Fever in this season often means death. Constanze sends for physicians. They arrive with solemn faces, thick coats, and medical kits that look more like torture devices than cures. They feel his pulse, peer at his tongue, mutter Latin diagnoses. One suggests bloodletting, another recommends poultices, another prescribes an herbal concoction so bitter that even a man who once wrote a comic opera about poison, that's così fan tutti, by the way, grimaces at the taste. Light joke number 2. You can almost hear Mozart groaning. Really, doctor? I'd rather eat a whole opera libretto than drink that sludge again. You sense the helplessness in the room. Constanze flits between tending to her husband and running to fetch whatever the doctors demand. Towels soaked in vinegar, hot bricks wrapped in cloth, herbal teas with names that sound more like curses. It's desperate, improvised medicine, the kind that buys time rather than cures. And yet, even through the fever haze, Mozart clings to music. He hums snatches of melodies, taps rhythms with weak fingers against the coverlet. He asks for friends to sing parts of the Requiem aloud, listening with half-closed eyes as though comparing reality against the perfect score already etched in his mind. Mainstream fact: during his last illness, friends like Joseph Hofer and Benedict Schack, singers from the Magic Flute, came to his bedside to sing through Requiem passages with him. Quirky tidbit: Mozart reportedly tried to sing along from bed, breaking off only when exhaustion overcame him. Debate. Some scholars argue these bedside rehearsals never happened, claiming later accounts were embellished for drama. Others insist the witnesses had no reason to fabricate. Step outside for a moment. You lean against the wall of Rauhensteingasse, snow falling heavier now. Passers-by scurry past, collars pulled high. The city itself is ill in winter. Short days, long nights, air heavy with smoke. You wonder how much the environment itself worsened his state. This wasn't the clean, bright Vienna of tourist postcards. This was a cramped, polluted, disease-ridden city where fevers bred in the damp air like uninvited guests. And so you stand there, torn between superstition and science. Was Mozart's fever just a tragic inevitability of 18th century life? Or was it something more? Malicious hands stirring the pot, an enemy slipping poison, a plot hiding under the guise of illness. Light joke number 3. Though honestly, if someone wanted to kill him slowly, they could have just forced him to sit through 3 hours of his rival's worst opera. That might have worked faster than mercury pills. Back upstairs, the fever climbs. His sheets are damp, his voice fainter, though he still mutters about measures and cadences. He asks Constanze to stay close, then lapses into uneasy sleep. Every so often, he startles awake, asking whether the trombones have entered yet, or whether the confutaris has been copied. It's delirium and genius twisted together. Constanze sits by the bed, candlelight catching her tired face. You imagine the soundscape: a man breathing in gasps, a wife whispering prayers, doctors arguing quietly in the hall, the city roaring on outside. This is fever in its rawest sense. Not just physical heat, but the fever of a life's work racing toward its end. And in that room, you sense the pivot of history. No one knows exactly why this fever grips him, or why it refuses to relent. But everyone feels the same dread. Once it has him, it may never let go. The door groans again as you step further into the cramped apartment on Rauhensteingasse, where every sound feels amplified by sickness and silence. Outside, Vienna clatters with sleigh bells and chatter. Inside, the rooms shrink around you, narrow corridors closing like a funnel, until everything resolves into one dimly lit chamber, where a genius sweats out his final days. The house on Rauhensteingasse isn't grand. You half expect a composer of Mozart's fame to live among marble columns and golden trim, but the reality is a staircase steep enough to trip a goat, plaster walls flaking like a bad sunburn, and floors that creak in complaint with every step. This isn't palatial living, it's survival, paycheck to paycheck, note to note. Mainstream fact: Mozart spent his last months in this modest rented apartment in Vienna's inner city near St. Stephen's Cathedral. Quirky detail: the exact location of his apartment is still debated, since the original building was demolished in the 1800s. So the Mozart house you might tour today is a reconstructed stand-in, part history, part tourist theater. Scholarly debate. Historians argue whether his financial state was truly desperate at this time, or whether his reputation for poverty was exaggerated later by biographers to dramatize his decline. You set your hand against the wall. The plaster is cold and rough beneath your fingers. The rooms smell of damp wood, candle soot, and the faint sharpness of vinegar rags, used to cool a fever. In the kitchen, a pot simmers thin broth, steam curling into the draft. Constanze hurries past, shawl clutched around her shoulders, murmuring instructions to the maid. Every corner of the house feels strained, buzzing with low-level panic. Mozart lies in the bedroom, propped on pillows, sheets tangled around his legs. The bed itself looks too small for the weight of his genius. It's a simple wooden frame, creaking under his restless movements. A few manuscripts litter the table at his side, ink smudged, lines half-finished. Imagine parchment curling where sweat-damp fingers touched it, the edges browned by the fire's smoke. The window rattles in the wind, and you notice the view. Narrow street below, spire of St. Stephen's just visible beyond rooftops. Every hour, the cathedral bells toll through the fog, marking time with a kind of cruel insistence. You wander through the rest of the apartment. The parlor holds a small fortepiano, battered but still gleaming, where hands have polished the wood through years of touch. You can almost hear echoes of children's laughter, Mozart's two surviving sons darting around, playing games while their father hammered away at the keys. But now the parlor is silent, save for the occasional scuff of footsteps. Light joke number 1. You might think of Mozart's house as some kind of bohemian hotspot, full of wine, wigs, and wild rehearsals. But in reality, it was more like a cramped Airbnb with broken heating and way too many unpaid bills stuck under the candlesticks. Constanze moves between rooms like a pendulum. She checks the kitchen, peers in on her husband, then rushes out again to meet visitors. Letters arrive almost daily, requests for scores, demands for payment, condolences from acquaintances who already smell the scent of death. She's juggling a household in free fall, trying to hold together the image of a family, while privately terrified. She may be days from widowhood. And still, amid the chaos, music intrudes. A half-finished fugue sits abandoned on the desk. A copy of the magic flute score lies open, perhaps still humming faintly in the air. The sound of genius lingers in every dusty corner, mocking the body now failing in the next room. You crouch near the fire, listening to the faint crackle. Heat barely radiates. Most of the wood is damp, poorly cured. A reminder of how expensive good firewood was in Vienna's winters. You picture Mozart shivering despite layers of blankets, his breath visible in the frigid bedroom air. Was the house itself complicit in his decline? Drafts, damp, chill. Conditions that could transform a minor fever into a mortal spiral. Mainstream anchor. Records show that epidemics of rheumatic fever and influenza surged through Vienna in late 1791, cutting through families in crowded homes like this. Quirky detail. Mozart supposedly once joked about using hot bricks wrapped in cloth to warm his feet. A crude but common Viennese winter hack. Scholarly debate. Whether environmental factors like poor heating and unsanitary living conditions accelerated his collapse, or whether his illness would have killed him no matter where he lived. Take a closer look at his writing desk. Ink wells, quills dulled at the tips, scraps of music scribbled like secret codes. There's evidence of a mind refusing to shut down, even as the body flickers. You can almost imagine him sitting upright, hours earlier, trying to notate the confutatis, only to slump sideways as a wave of fever stole his focus. His house became both cradle and coffin for his creativity, a place where every wall absorbed fragments of unfinished melodies. Here comes light joke number 2. If you've ever left a half-finished essay on your desk thinking, "I'll come back to it later," Mozart is here to remind you. Sometimes later never comes. And yes, your teacher is still less scary than death with a quill. The apartment is not silent though. The floorboards groan as visitors arrive. Friends, students, curious onlookers. The maid hustles tea and wine to the parlor. Doctors clump in the hallway, whispering. The house becomes a revolving door of footsteps, chatter, and uneasy silence. And through it all, Constanze is both hostess and guardian, trying to shield Mozart from too much disturbance. Imagine being inside these walls, night after night, hearing the muffled cough, the restless muttering. The air thickens, time slows. For neighbors outside, it's just another house. For those within, it's the universe collapsing in slow motion. Light joke number 3 sneaks in. Neighbors probably rolled their eyes, thinking, "Ugh, the Mozarts again? Always noise at odd hours." They had no idea that the noise upstairs was history being composed one shaky note at a time. And so, the house on Rauhensteingasse becomes more than just bricks and beams. It's a witness. It holds the fever, the prayers, the half-finished scores. It catches the tears Constanze hides in the kitchen. It amplifies the weight of every creak, every toll of St. Stephen's bells. This cramped, imperfect apartment is the stage for the last act of a life that had dazzled Europe. The mainstream fact you walk away with. Yes, this was Mozart's final home, modest and ordinary, not a palace of marble. The quirky image, him warming his feet on hot bricks in drafty rooms, and the debate whether these humble living conditions worsened his illness, or whether fate was simply indifferent to comfort, striking genius down wherever it lay. You linger a moment longer in the dim parlor, hand resting on the cold wood of the forte piano, before turning back toward the sick room. The house has given you its secrets, and the music lingers in the air like smoke that refuses to fade. You push the door open again, and there she is, Constanze, stationed like a soldier at the side of a battlefield that is now her own bedroom. The glow of a single candle flickers across her face, carving shadows that make her look older than her 30 years. Her husband lies restless in bed, whispering fragments of melody, and she is caught between hope and dread, pacing the narrow boards of the Rauhensteingasse apartment. Constanze's vigil is relentless. You watch her move, back and forth, fetching cloths soaked in vinegar to press against Mozart's forehead, arranging pillows beneath his shoulders, coaxing him to drink broth or water. She hardly sits. When she does, her hands fidget restlessly, twisting her kerchief, smoothing the crumpled sheets, or rifling through papers on the desk. To her, motion is survival. Stillness means she'll have to listen to the rasp of his breathing, to face the truth pressing in. Mainstream fact. Constanze really did stay close to Mozart in his last days, both caring for him and trying desperately to keep up with the household's needs. Money, visitors, medical arrangements. Quirky detail: she was advised by doctors to leave the house occasionally, so she wouldn't be overwhelmed by nervous exhaustion. But she often snuck back quickly, afraid that while she was gone, he would slip away. Scholarly debate. Historians still argue how much of Constanze's later stories about these days, Mozart predicting his death, dictating the Requiem to her, were literal truth or dramatized recollections meant to preserve his legend. You sit quietly in the corner, almost invisible, and watch the vigil unfold. Constanze rises again, lifts Mozart's hand, smooths the swollen fingers. She murmurs reassurances in soft German, half lullaby, half plea. The air smells of sweat, sour cloth, and fading candle wax. Somewhere outside, bells toll midnight, and she closes her eyes for just a moment before snapping them open again. She can't afford to drift. Sleep feels like betrayal. She pulls a small chair closer and perches at his bedside. His eyes flutter open, fever bright, and he mumbles something about the trombones in the tuba mirum. She leans forward, trying to catch his words, nodding as though she understands. She smooths his hair back, the gesture both maternal and desperate. In that instant, you feel the weight of her fear, not just of losing him, but of what comes next. Debts, widowhood, obscurity. The household around her still buzzes with motion. The maid clatters in the kitchen. Doctors murmur Latin diagnoses in the hallway. Friends visit, sometimes bringing music, sometimes wine, sometimes just a presence. And yet, Constanze bears the burden. She decides who enters the room, who is turned away. She balances Mozart's need for company with the risk of exhausting him. Imagine the calculation. Is one more conversation worth the drain on his strength? Light joke number 1. You realize Constanze in this moment is basically the 1791 version of a concert manager, bodyguard, and nurse rolled into one. Except her client keeps trying to sing Dies Irae while half-conscious. She leaves the room briefly, and you follow. In the parlor, she sits at the little desk, rifling through bills. Candlelight catches the ink scrawled across papers. Creditors demanding payment, reminders of debts, publishers bargaining for rights. She sighs, drops her head into her hands. For a moment, she looks crushed by it all, a young widow in waiting. Then she lifts her head, steels herself, and returns to the sick room, because despair is a luxury she can't afford right now. Mainstream anchor. Constanze really did face financial pressure. At Mozart's death, unpaid bills loomed large, and she had to scramble in the years after to stabilize her family by selling and publishing his works. Quirky aside, one creditor allegedly knocked on the Rauhensteingasse door, even while Mozart was bedridden, demanding repayment. Scholarly debate. Some biographers paint Constanze as opportunistic, managing Mozart's posthumous fame for profit. Others argue she was simply a practical survivor, doing what she had to do to protect her children. Back at his side, Constanze resumes her post. She holds his hand, strokes his arm, hums softly. At times, she sings fragments of his earlier songs, hoping to soothe him. Imagine her quiet voice, filling the room with echoes of music they once shared, melodies from happier days. Her vigil isn't only practical, it's spiritual. She prays, she lights candles, murmurs to saints, whispers, bargains into the dark. If he recovers, she promises she will dedicate herself more fully. She will sacrifice whatever is needed. Bargaining with God becomes a rhythm of its own, like the ticking of a clock. Light joke number 2. Though if heaven is anything like a court of law, you suspect the saints were already sighing. Lady, we've heard this bargain 3 times tonight. Please take a number. And yet, through all of this, she remains keenly aware of her role in Mozart's legend. You catch glimpses of it even now. The way she listens when he mutters about the Requiem. The way she preserves those words in memory. Later, she will retell these moments to friends and biographers, building the myth of the genius who wrote his own funeral music. Whether she exaggerates or not, you can see why. To her, every moment feels monumental, every sigh weighted with meaning. Mainstream note. Constanze later made sure that stories of Mozart's deathbed compositions circulated widely, shaping his image as a tragic genius. Quirky note. She even arranged for public performances of the Requiem, sometimes playing up the mystery commissioner element to attract audiences. Debate. Was Constanze consciously curating a myth for financial gain, or simply retelling the truth of what she felt in those nights? Historians split sharply on this. Hours drag on. The vigil continues. She dozes briefly in a chair, head nodding forward, then jolts awake when he stirs. The candle burns down, replaced by another. The room is timeless, a cocoon of whispers, coughs, and the scratch of quills as Süssmayr works in the corner. Light joke number 3. You think to yourself, if Mozart had been able to look over at his wife in those moments, he might have said, "Forget the Requiem. Write an opera called The Insomniac Wife. It'll be a hit." The vigil becomes not just Constanze's task, but her identity. She is anchor, nurse, manager, chronicler. She's the witness to his last breaths, the one who will carry his story forward. Without her, perhaps, much of what we think we know about these days would have dissolved into silence. So you watch her, candlelight haloing her tired face, as she bends once more over his hand, whispering assurances he may or may not hear. In her vigil, you see the last scaffolding holding up Mozart's collapsing world. And though she trembles, she never lets go. You're back in that cramped Vienna apartment. The air still sharp with winter cold. The stove rattling whenever the wind pushes against the chimney. Mozart lies in bed, his head rolling side to side, sometimes groaning, sometimes oddly alert. You can almost hear him muttering a phrase of melody, then losing it as fever drags him under again. And standing around him, like characters pulled from some strange apothecary's play, are the doctors. Now here's the thing. Medicine in the late 18th century was a curious mix of genuine observation, superstition, and outright guessing. Imagine walking into a pharmacy where half the shelves are herbs your grandmother swears by, and the other half are powders that could double as rat poison. That was the world Mozart's caretakers operated in. If you're expecting neat white coats and stethoscopes, you're out of luck. These men wore wigs, heavy coats, and often carried around their own tools, many of which looked like instruments of torture. The main doctor on call was Thomas Franz Closet. Yes, Closet. And if that sounds like someone who belongs in a cupboard, you're not far off. He was one of Vienna's Medici of standing, but you can't help picturing him fussing through his bag of vials, like a nervous chef grabbing the wrong spice jar. Closet's remedies leaned toward the popular treatments of the day: bloodletting, enemas, and powders to make you sweat out illness. You know, the sort of therapies where the patient often died before the disease did. Picture this: a basin set beside Mozart's bed, and Closet opening a case of shiny lancets. Bloodletting was still the default cure for fevers, no matter the cause. The logic went something like, if you've got too much bad blood, we'll drain it until you're better. The flaw, of course, was that patients already weak from illness often became weaker still. Imagine trying to play the piano concerto in D minor while running a marathon. Except, instead of endorphins, you're losing a pint of blood. Not exactly a winning combination. At one point, they probably used blistering treatments, mustard plasters, or chemicals applied to the skin to raise angry, painful welts. The idea was to draw the illness out through the surface. It's like putting a fire alarm on your arm and insisting the fire in your kitchen will get the hint. Mozart must have squirmed, perhaps even tried to joke through the sting. You can imagine him croaking to Constanze, "My dear, they want me to compose a symphony on my skin." But it wasn't just Closet. Vienna, as always, had opinions. Other physicians and healers floated in, offering contradictory advice. One might recommend cool cloths to reduce fever. Another insisted on wrapping Mozart in layers until he sweated like a boiled dumpling. And Constanze, desperate, listened to them all. Remember, this was a city where people drank unicorn horn, powders, and swore by them. If someone had walked in selling powdered comet dust, she might have bought it too. A quirky detail: some accounts say egg whites mixed with certain minerals were applied to the patient's skin as a kind of homemade medical dressing. Egg whites. Imagine Mozart lying there, sticky and uncomfortable, half breakfast, half experiment. You can't help but laugh, if only to stop yourself from cringing. Historians still argue whether these doctors helped at all or simply sped things along. On one side, defenders say Mozart was already far too ill, and the bleeding and potions were just the background noise of the inevitable. On the other side, critics suggest the treatments may have weakened him fatally. One scholar even went so far as to call Closet's methods murder by tradition. And you can't quite shake the image of Mozart as a victim, not just of disease, but of medicine itself. Meanwhile, Constanze did her best to balance medical authority with instinctive care. She dabbed his forehead, made sure he drank broth, and shielded him from interruptions. Yet whenever the doctors proposed another drastic remedy, she had little power to refuse. After all, these men were the experts, respected figures in a society that bowed to professional authority. Now close your eyes and picture the scene. The smell of vinegar, herbs, and sharp metallic tang from the tools. The creak of leather as Closet kneels beside the bed. Mozart's labored breathing filling the silence. Outside, Vienna bustles with carriages, markets, and music, unaware that the greatest composer of the age is being treated like a stubborn stain on history's white shirt, scrubbed, bled, and blistered until nothing is left. And yet somehow, in the gaps between delirium and exhaustion, he still hums. A phrase of the Requiem sneaks out, a haunting little sketch that outlasts the leeches, plasters, and poultices. Medicine may have been brutal, but the music refused to die, at least not yet. The fever rises and falls, like waves crashing against a breakwater. And yet, one thing never leaves Mozart's mind: the Requiem. That last great mass for the dead, the one he was convinced, half seriously, half in feverish dread, was being written for himself. You can almost feel the way the thought pressed down on him in those final weeks. Each time his eyes fluttered open, they darted toward the manuscripts scattered at the foot of his bed, as if to make sure the notes hadn't run away in the night. Quill, scratches, smudges of ink, Constanze's careful tidying. It all told him time was running out. But the work had to go on. Imagine lying on your back, sweat soaking through the linen, your pulse uneven, your head swimming, and still every nerve of your body reaching toward music. That was Mozart. The bed became his stage, the fever his conductor. He muttered fragments aloud. Confutatis maledictis? His voice cracked, but the phrasing carried that unmistakable urgency. When the fever broke just enough to give him strength, he dictated passages to his student, Franz Xaver-Süssmayr, or sometimes to friends who dared sit by his side. Picture it: the room dim, candlelight sputtering, Mozart's hand trembling in the air, as if he were still shaping melodies from an invisible orchestra only he could hear. Constanze watched with both dread and awe. She worried the obsession itself was killing him, keeping him awake, forcing him to push past the limits of a fragile body. At times, she even tried to hide the score, tucking the pages away to force him to rest. But Mozart would protest, begging, pleading, demanding his children back. He needed to cradle each phrase as though they were living things. The Requiem became his anchor, but also his torment. For every passage he completed, more remained unfinished, like doors he could never reach. He heard the lacrimosa swelling in his mind, yet only managed 8 bars before his strength collapsed. Imagine the agony. The music is there, burning, demanding birth, but the body refuses to serve. And then there was the shadowy figure who had commissioned it, the mysterious gray messenger who had come months earlier, cloaked in secrecy. Fever blurred memory and imagination, but Mozart could not shake the conviction that this man represented death itself. He told friends in moments of lucidity, "I am writing this for myself." A quirky fact. At one point, he tried to gather a few of his singers and colleagues around his bed to rehearse the completed sections. Yes, a sickbed rehearsal. The idea of musicians crowding into that cramped Rauhensteingasse apartment, while their master, pale and weak, beat time with trembling hands. It's haunting and strangely theatrical, like life imitating the very liturgy he was setting to music. Scholars still debate, was Mozart truly convinced of his own doom, or was this melodramatic talk from a man given to flair? Some argue the death obsession was later romanticized, shaped by Constanze and biographers who wanted the story to fit the drama of the music. Others think it was real, an unshakable intuition sharpened by illness. Either way, the Requiem became more than just a commission. It was his dialogue with eternity. Each Kyrie, each Confutatis, each Lacrimosa was a conversation with something vast and final. Fever blurred his sight, but music sharpened his soul. Close your eyes. Hear the hushed choral entry of the introitus, the pleading strings beneath, the solemn brass. This wasn't just work, it was farewell. With every note, Mozart was trying to write himself across the veil, as if the Requiem might carry him where words could not. And so, through the sickness, through the misguided remedies, through Constanze's tears and the doctor's lancets, he clung to the one thing that was utterly his, the music. Not even death could take that away. The house on Rauhensteingasse had grown quieter in those last weeks, but not silent, never silent. Doors opened and shut, boots clicked against the worn wood, voices murmured in the narrow corridor. The fevered composer was rarely left alone, and the constant shuffle of visitors brought with it an undercurrent of unease. Vienna, you must imagine, was a city alive with gossip, especially about its most brilliant and most enigmatic musician. Everyone seemed to have heard whispers about the mysterious commission of the Requiem, and now that Mozart lay sick, suspicions spread like wildfire. Constanze, weary but ever watchful, noticed it in the way some visitors lingered a little too long by the scattered pages, or how they exchanged glances as if trying to measure the truth of the rumors. Was it true, that Mozart was writing his own funeral mass. Was he cursed, poisoned, or simply exhausted by a life of overwork and underpay? One visitor stood out among them all: Count Franz von Walseg's messenger, the Grey Stranger. He had been the one to first deliver the anonymous commission months earlier, cloaked in secrecy, refusing to say for whom the music was intended. By now, everyone close to Mozart knew the truth. Count Walseg wanted to pass off the work as his own composition, as he had done with other pieces before. But to Mozart, fevered and frail, the man's presence felt spectral, uncanny. Imagine lying in bed, shivering, and seeing that silent figure again at the doorway. Cloak dark, face impassive. Was he here to collect the completed score, or to claim the soul of the composer himself? Mozart's friends swore he muttered once, "There he is again, the messenger of death." Not all the visitors were so grim. Students came, eager to serve, quills in hand. Franz Xaver Süssmayr, eager and loyal, took down dictations, though always with a shadow of nervousness. Could he ever capture exactly what Mozart intended? The composer, Johann Baptist Henneberg, also dropped by, offering help where he could, though one senses he too may have been there to see, out of both concern and curiosity, the decline of a genius. And then there was Antonio Salieri. Yes, that's Salieri. The rivalry between him and Mozart has been painted larger than life in plays and films. But in truth, they moved in overlapping circles, sometimes as adversaries, sometimes as colleagues. Did Salieri visit Mozart on his deathbed? Some sources say yes, that he offered comfort and even practical assistance. Others dismiss it as legend, but the suspicion clung, especially after later tales painted Salieri as Mozart's secret poisoner. Ah yes, the poison theory. Vienna loved a scandal, and what could be juicier than the idea that envy had driven a court composer to eliminate his rival? Even Constanze, in the midst of her grief, would hear the whispers that her husband's yellowed skin, his bloated limbs, were signs not of fever, but of deliberate poisoning. It was the kind of suspicion that could never be proved, yet never fully erased. Quirky detail. One evening, while visitors huddled in a stuffy apartment, Mozart supposedly asked for his bed to be turned so he could face the score pages more directly. Imagine the whole little gathering, half solemn, half awkward, shifting furniture around, while their master, drenched in sweat, still tried to peer at his beloved notes. The act was almost ceremonial, as though the music itself were his final altar, and everyone present had become witnesses. The debates among historians swirl endlessly. Who was really present in those final days? Did Salieri truly kneel at Mozart's bedside? Did Constanze banish some visitors to protect her husband's dwindling energy? And was the Grey Stranger merely a nervous servant of Count Walseg? Or did Mozart's fever transform him into something darker? One thing is clear: suspicion and curiosity crowded that little apartment as much as the visitors did. Each person who crossed the threshold carried their own motives: loyalty, love, rivalry, or simply the morbid thrill of seeing a genius at the edge of life. And in the middle of it all, Mozart lay in his bed, convinced of one thing above all: the Requiem must be finished. Suspicion could swirl, Visitors could come and go, but death itself would have to wait until the music was complete. Vienna, in the winter of 1791, was a city thick with smoke, frost, and chatter. You could not step into a coffee house, a tavern, or even a church vestibule without hearing someone mention the name Mozart. The man was everywhere. His melodies hummed by coachmen, played on cracked violins by street musicians, whistled absent-mindedly by children. But now, his name carried a different charge. People lowered their voices when speaking of him. Something was wrong, something dramatic. You can picture it, a dimly lit cafe near Stephansplatz, warm with candlelight and the bitter scent of roasted beans. Men in periwigs sit hunched over steaming cups, their words rising like the smoke curling toward the rafters. A banker leans in toward a minor noble and says, "They say he has been poisoned, you know." The nobleman raises his eyebrows. Poisoned. And by whom? That depends on who tells the story. Some say by jealous Italians at court. Some whisper of Masonic vengeance. Others, lowering their voices further still, dare to hint at Salieri. In another quarter of the city, perhaps in a bustling tavern where sausages crackle over the fire and cheap red wine sloshes into mugs, the gossip takes a different shape. The coachmen and shopkeepers who gather here have heard that Mozart is writing his own funeral mass. A requiem. What man would do such a thing unless he were cursed? Unless he had seen death's shadow standing at the end of his bed? Mark my words, one burly fellow declares, pounding the table for emphasis. No man who writes such music lives long to hear it played. The others nod, shuddering, half in jest, half in fear. And then there are the salons, those elegant drawing rooms where lace and silk rustle as ladies and gentlemen gather by firelight to exchange wit as well as rumor. Here, the conversation takes on a sharper, almost theatrical flair. A countess with an ivory fan sighs dramatically. "My dear, I heard from Baroness Waldstetten that poor Mozart believes himself poisoned." A gentleman with a glass of Tokay nods gravely. "It is the talk of the entire theater, of their Wieden," he insists. Salieri has been seen pacing about, restless. What else could it mean? The city thrives on such talk. Vienna in the late 18th century was a city of music, yes, but also of murmured intrigue. Information traveled not just through newspapers and printed pamphlets, but by mouths in motion, through coffeehouse waiters, servants who overheard private words, pupils who reported on their masters, singers who whispered backstage. Theaters were echo chambers, magnifying rumor as swiftly as applause. By the time one story had been told twice, it had been embroidered with new detail. And by the 10th telling, it was an opera of its own. Nowhere did this machinery of gossip work more feverishly than in the days when it became known that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart was gravely ill. To the outside world, he was only 35 years old, and yet people spoke of him as though he were already halfway into legend. His illness became a spectacle, even though few actually saw him. That little apartment on Rauhensteingasse became a stage, and Vienna its audience. Whispers of poison. Let us linger on the most dramatic rumor of all, that Mozart had been poisoned. In Vienna, poison was the gossip equivalent of fireworks. Scandalous, deliciously dark, irresistible. The fact that Mozart himself reportedly spoke of it only made the tale more powerful. "They are poisoning me," he is supposed to have said. "I know I must die." Who were they? That was the part left open for imagination, which made the story endlessly adaptable. To some, the villain was Antonio Salieri, the court composer, Italian-born, and rumored to resent Mozart's genius. In truth, their relationship was complex, sometimes competitive, sometimes respectful. But gossip flattens complexity. It prefers villains and victims. So Salieri became, in some circles, the serpent in the garden, the man with the vial in hand. Others, especially those fascinated by secret societies, pointed the finger at the Freemasons. Mozart, after all, was a Mason himself. He had written music for their lodges, including the stirring Masonic funeral music. But what if he had displeased them? What if he had revealed too much in the magic flute, with its overt Masonic symbolism? A whisper here, a nod there, and suddenly, Mozart's illness was recast as Masonic retribution. Still others blamed his own overwork. But in gossip, dull explanations rarely win. Exhaustion and rheumatic fever didn't turn heads in coffee houses. Poison, on the other hand, kept tongues wagging for weeks. The Grey Stranger. Of course, gossip also clung to the mysterious figure who had commissioned the Requiem. To ordinary Viennese ears, the story sounded almost like a Gothic novel. A cloaked stranger appears, delivers money, and demands a mass for the dead without giving his name. Who could resist retelling such a tale? By now, word had spread that the commissioner was acting on behalf of Count Franz von Walsegg, a man with a peculiar habit of paying others to compose music, which he then claimed as his own. But for the ordinary people of Vienna, Walsegg wasn't half so interesting as the image of a ghostly messenger at Mozart's door. The stranger became death himself in the retelling, silent, implacable, waiting. Music in the streets. Even as these darker tales spread, the city's musicians kept Mozart's notes alive. Imagine walking through the snow-slicked lanes near the Kärntner Tor Theater, hearing a fiddler scraping out a phrase from the magic flute, which had premiered only weeks before. The opera was still the talk of the city. Papageno's comic bird catcher's song had become a kind of street anthem, hummed by washerwomen and bricklayers alike. And yet, as the city laughed and sang those tunes, it also whispered, "Mozart lies dying. He writes his own Requiem." There is something uncanny about that juxtaposition. Joyful melodies fluttering through the air, even as people spoke of the composer's imminent death. Constanze against the gossip. Inside the Rauhensteingasse apartment, Constanze was aware of the talk swirling outside. She knew how cruel gossip could be. After all, Mozart had lived with it his whole life. Whispers that he was childish, extravagant, irresponsible with money. Now those same tongues wove his illness into a tapestry of intrigue. She fought back in the only way she could, by controlling access. Not everyone who wanted to see Mozart was admitted. Visitors were carefully filtered, and she shielded her husband from stories that might agitate him further. Still, she couldn't prevent every rumor from slipping through the cracks. Mozart himself repeated the suspicion that someone sought his life. Whether this was fevered delusion or genuine fear remains uncertain. But the gossip had already penetrated the sick room, the theaters, and the clergy, beyond the cafes and salons. Even the churches and theaters joined in the speculation. Priests debated whether composing one's own requiem was an act of piety or presumption. Actors joked darkly backstage about who might play Mozart in the next after-dinner farce. Music publishers whispered about what would happen to the unfinished works. Who might finish them? Who might profit? In this way, the gossip was not just idle chatter. It had practical implications. Everyone knew that when a composer died, his manuscripts scattered quickly, some to patrons, some to students, some to the auction block. Already, there were those in Vienna angling to secure a page, a phrase, a fragment of the genius before it vanished. A quirky detail. Here's one of those odd, telling details. A coffeehouse waiter supposedly remarked that he knew Mozart must be dying because the gentlemen at his tables were suddenly drinking more chocolate than coffee. Why? Because chocolate was associated with mourning, thick, dark, and heavy. Coffee was for lively debate, but chocolate was for solemn whispers. Whether or not the detail is true, it captures something of the city's mood. Vienna consumed Mozart's decline, almost like a fashionable delicacy. Historians debate, modern scholars continue to debate how much of this gossip reflected reality. Was the poison story purely invention? Most doctors now believe Mozart died of a rheumatic fever, compounded by infection. But the persistence of the poison rumor, whispered for generations afterward, shows how deeply it lodged in the cultural imagination. Gossip, once born, is harder to kill than fact. The city as chorus, and so Vienna itself became like a chorus in one of Mozart's own operas, commenting, speculating, weaving together strands of fear, admiration, envy, and awe. The city could not keep still. It had to talk, to shape the story even as it unfolded. Each alley and parlor became an echo chamber, amplifying the drama of one man's illness into a spectacle for all. For the dying composer, lying in his narrow bed, the voices of the city may have been inaudible. But for us, looking back, those voices form part of the music of the moment. The gossip is not just background noise, it is the counterpoint, the restless accompaniment to Mozart's final struggle. You have barely let the rumors of Vienna settle in your ears when a name keeps surfacing again and again. Antonio Salieri. Ah yes, the court composer, the Italian who once occupied the glittering post Mozart so desperately wanted. His shadow lurks like a character written into Mozart's story, sometimes villain, sometimes mentor, often misunderstood. But in Vienna, gossip sticks like spilled beer to a tavern table, and Salieri's name becomes woven into Mozart's death in ways that no evidence has ever managed to fully support. Imagine yourself in the smoky corners of a Viennese tavern again, mid-December 1791. You sip something warm that tastes vaguely of cloves and slightly of dishwater, and you listen. Over there, two men in powdered wigs lean close, whispering. They say Salieri poisoned him out of jealousy. The other raises his eyebrows, pretending to be shocked, though you can tell he already heard the tale 3 times today. The seed has been planted. Now it grows like a vine, twisting and curling until no one remembers where it began. Here's the mainstream fact to ground you. Historically, there is no evidence Salieri poisoned Mozart. The record shows Salieri attended Mozart's operas, sometimes conducted them, and even helped stage his works at court. They were competitors, yes, but in an 18th century musical ecosystem where every composer fought for commissions and patronage, rivalry was the normal climate. It didn't mean attempted murder. But here's the quirky bit. Years after Mozart's death, Salieri himself, slipping in and out of mental confusion near the end of his long life, supposedly muttered confessions that he had poisoned Mozart. Imagine old Antonio in a Viennese hospital around 1823, frail and plagued by guilt or delusion. Did he really say it? Some witnesses insisted yes. Others said it was gossip, inflated by eager ears. It became the stuff of eerie legend, like an old man's bedside ramblings, morphing into historical scandal. Historians still argue whether those supposed confessions were ever credible or simply the result of Salieri's dementia and the delight of rumor mongers who wanted a juicy villain. Even today, scholarly ink is spilled over whether Mozart's own paranoia during his illness, where he told Constanze and his pupils that he believed he'd been poisoned, helped fuel the myth. Did Mozart himself, in fever dreams, accidentally script the plot twist that would haunt Salieri forever? Picture Salieri in his prime, dignified, Italian flair, his waistcoat sharp, his court position secure. He'd trained singers, composed operas, and influenced the next generation, including young Beethoven, Schubert, and Liszt. Not bad for a supposed poisoner. And yet, when you fast forward in time, the Salieri remembered by the masses isn't the composer of dozens of operas. It's the jealous schemer of stage and screen. Pushkin wrote him that way. Rimsky-Korsakov turned the drama into an opera. And in the 20th century, Peter Schaffer's Amadeus immortalized Salieri as the envious murderer who brought down Mozart with a vial of toxin. The myth became larger than the man. You almost have to chuckle. Poor Salieri spent his entire life worrying about being forgotten next to Mozart. And thanks to the poison story, he was remembered forever. Irony at its most theatrical. Back in 1791, though, this gossip was raw, alive, whispered between pews in church or muttered in the corridors of court. Did Salieri sense it? Did it cling to him, even then? We can't be sure, but you imagine him straightening his wig, determined to carry on, even as his name floated like a ghost behind Mozart's coffin. And so, in this chapter of the Long December, you find yourself hovering between fact and fiction, watching as envy is turned into poison by the alchemy of rumor. Was Salieri Mozart's friend, rival, or murderer? The city leaned toward one answer. History still refuses to close the case. It is a cold, raw December morning in Vienna. The bells of St. Stephen's Cathedral toll heavy and slow, their echoes stretching across the narrow streets like a black veil. You're standing in that hush which only follows after a death that shocks not by grandeur, but by its quiet tragedy. The city has been buzzing with gossip about poison, commissions, fever, and unfinished masterpieces. But now it must contend with something much plainer, much more human. A burial, and not a grand burial. Not one fit for the genius whose music had kissed the ear of heaven and pulled tears from emperors and peasants alike. No, this was to be a different sort of farewell. A burial without grandeur. The setting, you pull your cloak tighter as you walk with a small cluster of mourners toward the cemetery gates. The wind cuts, but more than the cold is the loneliness that clings to this procession. Mozart was not given a great state funeral, nor a ceremony with musicians lined in solemn ranks to play him into eternity. Instead, he receives what was customary for many Viennese at the time, a third-class burial. Now, before your imagination paints this as abject poverty, let's ground ourselves in fact. Third-class burials were common, even for middle-class families. The Enlightenment reforms of Emperor Joseph II had, just a few years earlier, reshaped funeral customs in Vienna. Grand Baroque funerals with endless torches and elaborate tombs were discouraged as wasteful and unhygienic. Cemeteries inside the city were closed to prevent overcrowding and disease. Burials were moved outside the walls. The ideal was efficiency, cleanliness, and, most of all, equality before death. So when you hear common grave, it does not necessarily mean Mozart was tossed in a ditch like refuse. Rather, he was interred in a shared grave, standard practice under Joseph II's decrees. Yet still, the image lingers. One of the greatest composers in history, laid to rest with only a handful to witness. The small procession, Constanze, Mozart's widow, is absent from the burial itself. She is devastated, her health fragile after weeks of strain, and she simply cannot face it. She remains at home, worn by grief, perhaps clinging to the thought of his unfinished Requiem. Instead, Mozart's friends and colleagues make the walk. Among them are Franz Xaver Süssmayr, the pupil who will finish the Requiem, Emanuel Schikaneder, the theater impresario who gave Mozart the magic flute, and a few quiet others whose names history has not preserved. Imagine them huddled against the wind, their boots crunching against the frozen ground as they make their way beyond the city walls to the cemetery of St. Mark's. No bands, no choirs, no banners, just the silence of footsteps and breath. St. Mark's Cemetery. St. Mark's is not a sprawling monumental ground you might picture from later centuries. In 1791, it is a modest cemetery, practical and ordered by regulation. Graves are marked with wooden crosses designed to decay and return to the earth within a decade or so. The idea was not eternal resting places with marble slabs, but rather the recycling of land. After 10 years, graves were reopened, bones collected, and moved to charnel houses, and the plot used again. You stand at the edge of the open pit. A priest recites the rites. The coffin is plain. Mozart's body is lowered down. No markers will endure. No stone carved with angelic cherubs. Just earth, snow, and time. And then, almost shockingly quickly, the mourners depart. That's how it was done. Efficient, spare. Funerals were not the elaborate affairs we might expect for someone of Mozart's genius. Instead, Vienna, with its Enlightenment regulations, demanded a sort of egalitarian austerity. Death was not spectacle. It was procedure, the absence of grandeur. Here's where the human ache comes in. You feel the absence. The city that rang with its operas, that hummed with the arias of the marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, does not line the streets. No imperial carriage attends. No monuments are raised that day. For a man who had brought emperors and empresses to tears, his own farewell is startlingly unceremonious. Imagine if you had been a neighbor. You might not even have known the burial was happening. You'd have heard the rumors, the fever, the death. But unless you belonged to that small circle, you would have missed the quiet interment at St. Mark's. And within weeks, the ground itself would show no sign of Mozart's grave. Constanze's later struggle. It is important to linger here. Constanze's absence is not neglect. She adored him, fought for him, supported him. After his death, she will spend decades ensuring his music is preserved, published, performed, and revered. If not for her tireless efforts, much of what we know of Mozart might have been scattered into obscurity. She is his fiercest advocate after death. But on this raw December morning, she is too broken to walk to St. Mark's. The scholarly debate. Now let's pull back, because even here, controversy lingers. Historians debate whether Mozart was buried truly in a pauper's grave, or rather in the standard fashion of a respectable Viennese third-class funeral. Some argue the tale of abject poverty and indignity is exaggerated, perhaps embroidered by later romanticists who loved the tragic image of genius unrecognized. Others insist that yes, it was indeed pitiful, that the lack of ceremony reflected Mozart's financial struggles and declining status at court. The truth, as often, lies somewhere in between. His burial was modest by regulation, not necessarily by neglect. But still, the contrast between the splendor of his music and the simplicity of his farewell creates a powerful emotional chord. The quirky detail. Here's a quirky, almost ghostly detail for you. In the decades after his death, people began trying to identify the exact spot of Mozart's grave. But St. Mark's had no permanent markers, and by the time curiosity turned into obsession, the site had already been reused. To this day, no one knows exactly where Mozart's bones rest. A monument now stands in St. Mark's, a weeping angel draped in sorrow, but it is symbolic, not precise. So when people lay flowers, they are not placing them on Mozart himself, but on the idea of him, the myth of him, the memory of that quiet burial without grandeur. Closing atmosphere. Stand there a while longer. The mourners are gone. The snow begins to fall again, soft, indifferent, muffling the last sounds of the spades as earth was thrown onto wood. There are no trumpets, no choir, no grand requiem echoing through vaulted stone, just silence. And perhaps, if you strain, you can almost imagine the faintest whisper of music drifting on the cold December air. Was it a fragment of the Requiem, unfinished, or just the memory of genius echoing through the stillness of a burial that passed without grandeur? And that, perhaps, is the greatest irony of all. The man who wrote music that seemed to open the heavens was himself laid into the earth with a ceremony designed to erase him. Yet he endures, not in stone, not in marble, not in the soil of St. Mark's, but in every note that followed, every stage that still resounds with his melodies. You can almost feel the chill in the small apartment, even though winter has passed. Mozart is gone, but Constanze lingers in the shadow of his absence, pacing the same wooden floorboards, where only months before she had listened to his half-finished melodies drift through the air. You imagine her fingers tracing the outlines of the sheets of music, left scattered, as though touching them might bring him back. Instead, what she's left with is silence. Well, silence and a mountain of debt big enough to make even a modern student loan borrower choke on their coffee. Constanze is 29, a widow before 30, mother to 2 surviving boys, Karl and Franz Xaver, and suddenly the person everyone points to when the question arises, what will become of Mozart's music? And more pressingly, how will you keep a roof over your head? You might assume that the world would rush to support the widow of a genius. Spoiler, it doesn't. Mozart died owing money, plenty of it. Creditors don't care that he wrote Don Giovanni or the Magic Flute. They want their ducats. Vienna isn't exactly overflowing with sympathy. It's overflowing with gossip, as you remember. Some whispered poison. Others whispered divine punishment. And more than a few just shrugged and said, shouldn't have lived so extravagantly. Mainstream fact here. Mozart did live beyond his means. He spent freely, partly out of optimism, partly because he always believed the next big commission was around the corner. He moved through life like someone who knew he was brilliant and assumed the world would eventually pay up. Sometimes it did. More often, it didn't. Now, Constanze inherits that mess. She has to figure out how to feed her children, preserve her husband's reputation, and not collapse from grief. Imagine balancing those 3 tasks at once, while every person you meet either wants money from you or wants to dissect your husband's life. It's the late 18th century equivalent of going viral on social media for all the wrong reasons. But Constanze isn't passive. She has grit. You see her starting to organize memorial concerts. Almost immediately, she knows Mozart's name still carries weight, and she can turn that into income. Picture her standing in a concert hall, the Requiem being performed, a packed audience, sitting spellbound. Every ticket sold is a ducat toward survival. Every applause is a tiny piece of validation. He mattered. He still matters. Of course, it isn't also noble. Constanze is also, frankly, strategic. Quirky tidbit time, she remarries within a few years, this time to a Danish diplomat and writer named Georg Nikolaus von Nissen. And here's the kicker. He later co-authors one of the earliest biographies of Mozart. Talk about blending business with personal life. Imagine marrying someone and then saying, oh, by the way, could you immortalize my dead husband in print? That's dedication or opportunism, depending on how cynical you feel. But back in the raw days of 1792 and 1793, she's still alone. You can almost smell the ink as she writes desperate letters, petitioning noble patrons for financial support. She leans hard on the emperor's court, pleading for a pension. Eventually, she gets some assistance, though it's not immediate and not nearly as generous as you'd expect for the widow of one of Europe's greatest composers. And then there's the emotional side. Historians still argue whether Constanze truly grasped the full extent of Mozart's genius, or if she mostly saw him as a troubled, unreliable husband. She adored him, certainly, but she also suffered through his moods, his illnesses, his deaths, and his restless creativity. In widowhood, though, she begins to polish the legend. She starts reshaping the story of Mozart into something larger, something marketable. You watch her slowly realize grief and legacy can pay the bills. She manages to secure her son's musical education too. Franz Xaver, the younger, even becomes a composer and pianist in his own right, though living forever in the long shadow of Papa Mozart. Imagine being a child trying to write your own symphony while people whisper, "Well, it's good, but is it Mozart good?" That's like inventing an app and having everyone compare it to Steve Jobs. No pressure. In one of those quieter evenings, you picture Constanze sitting at her writing desk, candles flickering, a quill scratching out a letter. The boys are asleep. The city outside is indifferent. She pauses and listens, half expecting to hear a melody drifting in, half knowing it never will again. And then she returns to the paper, writing not just for money, but for survival, for remembrance, for control of a story that was starting to slip away into myth and gossip. Here's the irony. In losing Mozart, Constanze gains power she never had while he lived. She becomes the curator of his memory, the agent of his reputation, the gatekeeper of his manuscripts. Without her stubborn efforts, much of his work might have scattered into obscurity. But thanks to her, the music continues to circulate, continues to be played, continues to echo. You wonder if she ever smiled at the thought that though the man was gone, his notes kept dancing in the world, and she had ensured it. You return again to that dim, fever-damp room in December 1791, the air still thick with the ache of loss. Mozart is gone. His final sigh has left the chamber, and Vienna is adjusting to the absence of a man who, for all his brilliance, always seemed just a little too mortal, a little too fragile. And here's where things turn clinical, almost cold. Because as much as grief overwhelmed Constanze, as much as gossip flooded Vienna, there were also doctors, men in black coats with steady hands, who saw not just a genius gone, but a body that might offer answers. Answers to the whispers. What killed Mozart? Was it fever? Poison? Overwork? God's punishment? The truth, like most truths, is messy. In the weeks after Mozart's death, at least 2 physicians examined him, and early autopsy notes, though far less detailed than what we'd expect today, began to circulate. They weren't what we'd think of as a modern autopsy. No clean surgical table, no formal dissection with detailed records. Instead, this was more a cause of death memorandum, scribbled down from the memory of swollen limbs, a feverish body, and an exhaustion that had hollowed him out. The mainstream fact: the earliest medical reports described Mozart's body as suffering from severe miliary fever, a vague catch-all diagnosis in the late 18th century. Miliary didn't mean what we think of now. It wasn't one specific disease. It referred to rashes and spots on the skin that resembled millet seeds. In short, it was shorthand for the man died of some wasting fever with a rash, and we don't really know why. But then comes the quirky, eyebrow-raising detail. Witnesses later recalled Mozart's body swelling after death, his limbs puffed, his skin stretched tight. To his family and friends, this looked unnatural, sinister. The word vergiftung, poisoning, began to slip into hushed conversations. A swollen body. That must mean someone slipped him something foul. In Vienna's candlelit taverns, the rumor spread like spilled wine. Mozart was murdered. Here's where the scholarly debate comes in. And oh, is it a lively one? Some modern researchers argue that Mozart died of rheumatic fever, something that could return again and again in his lifetime, weakening his heart and kidneys until he finally succumbed. Others point to trichinosis, a parasite from undercooked pork. A quirky but plausible theory, since Mozart loved eating pork cutlets. Still others argue it was kidney failure, perhaps even linked to repeated strep infections. The debate remains unresolved, like a dissonant chord left hanging in the air. But in those early weeks after his burial, none of that mattered. The so-called autopsy notes were short, unsatisfying, almost perfunctory. No detailed analysis, no preserved organs, no medical certainty, just vague terms: fever, swelling, collapse. Enough ambiguity to keep every conspiracy theory alive. Picture Constanze reading those words. She wants answers, but what she gets is vagueness. Miliary fever. That's not a reason. That's a shrug in Latin. And to make things worse, she knows how Vienna thrives on mystery. Every lack of detail, every shadow of doubt, every doctor's note that ends with a question mark instead of a period only fuels the gossip mill harder. You imagine her sitting with friends in the Rauhensteingasse apartment, holding one of these scraps of medical description in her hands, her eyes scanning the words. The paper doesn't explain why her husband suddenly wasted away. It doesn't explain why he was planning trips, writing music, dreaming of commissions just days before he collapsed. It doesn't explain why she's now a widow with 2 children and debts. And yet, these sparse medical reports become the foundation for centuries of speculation. No other autopsy exists, no preserved tissue, no bones. Mozart's grave was unmarked, his body eventually lost in the common graveyard rotation. The early notes are all we have. They're less an explanation, more an open invitation for everyone with a theory: poison, infection, divine justice, to have their say. The irony? Those doctors likely never imagined their scribbles would be dissected, debated, and reinterpreted for over 200 years. They probably thought, another fever, death. Tragic, but hardly unusual. In Vienna at the time, fever was a common killer, but they weren't dealing with another man. They were dealing with Mozart. And for Mozart, vagueness would never do. So you leave that room of ink-stained papers, feeling the frustration Constanze must have felt. Instead of closure, she gets ambiguity. Instead of truth, she gets rumor fuel. Instead of her husband's genius shining pure in memory, it gets tangled in medical half-answers and suspicious glances. And in the silence after you close the file of early autopsy notes, you hear it, the growing hum of a myth that will outlive both diagnosis and fact. A myth that whispers. He was too great to die of something ordinary. Someone must have wanted him gone. You sit once again in Vienna, December frost, biting at the cobblestones, the air alive with rumor. Mozart is barely in the ground, and already the city is talking loudly, recklessly, sometimes cruelly. Not just about the genius lost, but about how he was lost. The official word, miliary fever, is vague, too vague for a man whose life was anything but ordinary. To most Viennese, such a diagnosis feels insulting. Fever? Rash? The same ailment that carries off chimney sweeps and washerwomen? No, they whisper. Mozart must have gone differently. He was too special, too brilliant, too singular. His death couldn't be mundane. It had to be mysterious. And that's when the word spreads. Poison, the seed of suspicion. It begins quietly, almost innocently, with the detail that Mozart's body swelled after death. Those who saw him claimed his skin stretched tight, his face bloated, his limbs puffed. In an age without modern understanding of decomposition, such a sight was alarming. To some, it screamed poisoning. Then, of course, there was Mozart himself. In his final days, feverish and delirious, he is said to have murmured that he was being poisoned. Friends remembered him whispering that he had been given a requiem for himself, that someone had commissioned his death through music and through venom alike. Were these the hallucinations of a sick man, or the confessions of someone who knew too much? Constanze, torn between worry and exhaustion, tried to hush such talk. She needed stability, not scandal. But Vienna had other plans. The story of Mozart's death by poison was too delicious not to repeat. Salieri in the shadows. Inevitably, suspicion found its favorite target, Antonio Salieri. He was older, established, respected at court. He had been a rival, at least in the public imagination. And Vienna, like all cities, adored a good rivalry. Never mind that Salieri had helped Mozart at times, recommending him for positions, staging his works. In the collective memory, they were opposites. Mozart, the fiery genius. Salieri, the cautious craftsman. And so, gossip twisted the narrative. If Mozart had been poisoned, surely Salieri was the hand behind the vial. Surely envy had driven him. Surely the Italian at court had grown tired of the young German stealing the spotlight. It didn't matter that there was no evidence. It didn't matter that Salieri wept at Mozart's funeral, or that he continued to speak warmly of him. Once the rumor found soil, it grew. A quirky aside, Vienna's poison obsession. Here's a quirky detail you might not expect. 18th century Vienna was obsessed with poison plots. The newspapers of the day carried endless tales of suspicious powders, deadly tonics, and Italian benefici, poisoners. Households kept antidotes in their cabinets, the way we keep aspirin today. The idea of being poisoned wasn't far-fetched. It was practically fashionable. Add to this the popular theater, which thrived on stories of betrayal, intrigue, and poisoned goblets, and you have the perfect storm. Audiences were primed to believe that any dramatic fall must have a dramatic cause. Mozart, the composer of operas, filled with jealous lovers and scheming villains, suddenly seemed to have become a character in one of his own works. Constanze's dilemma. Imagine Constanze now. She is in mourning, but also practical. Debts weigh heavily. 2 young children cling to her, and around her, people whisper, "Your husband was poisoned. Your husband was betrayed." What does she do? If she leans into the rumor, she risks making powerful enemies at court. If she denies it too strongly, people think she's covering something up. So she treads carefully. She keeps silent in public, but in private, she cedes. After all, what would it mean if Mozart had been poisoned? It would mean his life was stolen not just by fate, but by malice. That she, Constanze, had lost her husband not to nature, but to conspiracy. Such a thought could eat a person alive. The scholarly debate. Now step forward 2 centuries, because historians love this question. Was Mozart poisoned? Some point to the swelling, the delirium, the fever, and say arsenic, or antimony, or mercury. All were present in medicines of the time. Others argue the opposite, that his symptoms match rheumatic fever, kidney failure, or strep infections, common killers in the 18th century. The most compelling evidence against poison, Constanze herself. If she truly believed Salieri or anyone else had poisoned her husband, would she have allowed Salieri to teach her son, Franz Xaver, years later? Would she have dined with him, spoken of him, tolerated his presence? Hardly. And yet, the rumor refused to die. Even in the 1820s, Salieri, old and half-mad, supposedly confessed to poisoning Mozart. Scholars dispute this too. Some say he never said it, others that he raved in delirium, still others that the confession was fabricated. The ambiguity is maddening and irresistible. A city that needed drama. Step back into Vienna of 1792. Imagine the taverns, the candlelit salons, the chatter of aristocrats and servants alike. The empire was restless, revolutions stirred across Europe, and fear was in the air. Against this backdrop, Mozart's death was more than just the passing of a composer. It was a stage on which the city acted out its anxieties. Was the court corrupt? Then surely Mozart was silenced. Was envy dangerous? Then surely Salieri was guilty. Was genius too fragile for this world? Then surely fate itself conspired to cut him down. Every rumor, every theory said as much about Vienna as it did about Mozart. The music as evidence. And here's where the strangest twist of all enters. People began to read Mozart's music as evidence of his murder. The dark tones of the Requiem became, in gossip, not a commissioned work, but a death march he had been forced to write for himself. The Lacrimosa was no longer just a lament for mankind. It was his own funeral lament. Art and life blurred, until it seemed almost inevitable that Mozart had been both the victim and the prophet of his own demise. The curtain falls, for now. As you step away from Rauhensteingasse, the whispers cling to your coat like smoke. You can almost hear the tavern voices. It was poison. It was envy. It was Salieri. It was fate. The truth remains hidden, The evidence too thin, the witnesses too unreliable. But in a way, it doesn't matter, because Mozart's death, like his life, became a story people couldn't stop retelling. And in that story, poison and plot will always linger, like unresolved dissonance. You realize, as you leave, that sometimes rumors are more powerful than facts. And for Mozart, the rumor of poison would shape his afterlife almost as much as his music shaped his life. You think back to that night, the bitter cold of December, the flickering candles, the way the church bells tolled low over Vienna, and you can almost see Mozart's frail figure lowered into the ground. Only that memory, even if you're imagining it in vivid detail, is already fogged. Because the strangest thing about Mozart's death is this: his body, the very thing that could have answered centuries of speculation, is gone. Not misplaced in the way you might misplace your keys or a sock in the laundry, but vanished in the sense of no longer traceable, no longer touchable, no longer something science can put a scalpel to. The composer who gave the world symphonies and operas is, physically speaking, dust, dissolved into the earth of Vienna with no way back. That fact hits differently when you realize how it happened. Mozart wasn't buried like a king, with monuments and crypts and marble effigies. He wasn't even buried like a comfortable middle-class craftsman. He went into what was called a gemeines Grab, a common grave. That doesn't mean paupers only, but it means unmarked, simple, practical. In late 18th century Vienna, Joseph II's enlightened reforms had discouraged lavish burials, arguing that even in death, people shouldn't take up too much space or too much wealth. So Mozart, one of the greatest composers to ever live, was laid in the ground alongside strangers, covered in lime to speed the decomposition, and left without a headstone. If you tried to point at the exact spot today, you couldn't. Even contemporaries couldn't a few years later. That's the root of the mystery. The quirky part is that years later, one gravedigger claimed he'd kept track of Mozart's skull. He supposedly exhumed it when the grave was reopened, smuggled it away, and passed it down until eventually it ended up in the hands of collectors, and later in the Salzburg Mozarteum. But whether that skull actually belonged to Mozart or to some poor neighbor in the pit remains hotly debated. Modern tests have tried comparing DNA from that skull to known descendants, but the results have been inconclusive. Historians still argue whether that piece of bone really connects us to the composer, or whether it's a macabre relic born of wishful thinking. Imagine the irony. Mozart, the man who obsessed over leaving every note in place, now represented by a questionable skull in a glass case. You drift in the narrative, picturing Constanze years later. She wanted something tangible of her husband, something to prove his greatness. Yet the very city that once gossiped about poisonings and scandals also failed to give him a grave worth visiting. Pilgrims came asking where Mozart rested, and all Constanze could do was gesture vaguely towards St. Mark's Cemetery. That vagueness became myth. People told stories of secret burials, of conspiracies to hide his corpse, of Masonic rituals carried out at midnight. Most of these are embellishments, whispered around candlelight, and retold until the line between fact and fantasy blurred. The mainstream fact is harsh but simple. Mozart's body dissolved in an unmarked common grave, following Viennese regulations of the time. The quirky detail is the gravedigger's alleged skull snatching, a tale that makes the story feel almost Gothic. And the open scholarly debate is eternal, whether the remains in Salzburg really belong to Mozart, and whether any part of him survives beyond rumor and legend. It leaves you with a strange unease. To this day, you can walk in St. Mark's Cemetery, hear the birds, feel the grass underfoot, see the memorial stone placed there decades later. But the man himself, the bones that once vibrated with music, are lost. He became immortal in sound precisely because he vanished in body. You picture that paradox: the earth swallowing the flesh, the air forever carrying the notes. And as you settle into this realization, it almost feels right. Because Mozart, of all people, was never meant to be pinned down by stone or coffin. You lie back, closing your eyes, and the years begin to peel away like wallpaper. It's no longer December 1791. Instead, the decades stretch forward, carrying whispers of physicians, scholars, and curious minds who, long after Mozart's bones had melted into the soil, tried to piece together what really happened to him. The man who once seemed immortal in music had died at just 35, and no one could agree why. Fever, infection, poison, a lifetime of overwork. His death certificate, that single scrap of parchment filed in Vienna, gives only one word: Hitziges Frieselfieber. You roll that term around in your mind. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Severe miliary fever, they called it. A phrase broad enough to cover everything from typhoid to scarlet fever to any old rash that came with high temperature and delirium. Medical language in the late 18th century was more poetry than precision. Doctors didn't have microscopes sharp enough to see bacteria, nor tests to pick out exact causes. They worked with the senses, what they could see, smell, touch, or hear in the rattle of a chest. A red rash, a swollen belly, a lingering cough. Each symptom folded into catch-all terms that today feel more like metaphors than diagnoses. So, when Mozart collapsed that winter, doctors noted fever, swelling, weakness, and delirium. They prescribed bleeding and blistering, the usual remedies meant to balance the humors. And he died anyway. But the story didn't end with the burial. It began. The 19th century obsession. Fast forward a few decades. The Romantic century adored tragic geniuses. Artists who died young were like holy martyrs of creativity. And what was more poetic than Mozart struck down in the middle of composing his own Requiem. Writers in the 1800s couldn't resist adding drama. Poisoned by rivals, consumed by mysterious plagues, sacrificed to destiny. Doctors, too, joined the speculation, their pens almost as florid as the librettos in Mozart's operas. One said it was acute miliary fever, sticking close to the death certificate, but offering no real explanation. Another claimed rheumatic fever, the body's immune system turning on itself, inflaming joints and heart, perhaps triggered by repeated throat infections. Others suggested uremia, kidney failure, or trichinosis, an odd one, based on the idea that Mozart loved pork cutlets and might have eaten undercooked meat. By the late 19th century, whole journal articles read like detective novels, each scholar insisting their diagnosis solved the riddle. And then came the whispers about poisoning. The Salieri rumor fed fuel to this medical speculation. What if the swelling and weakness came not from natural illness, but from arsenic slipped into a glass of wine? What if Mozart's mysterious patron for the Requiem wanted him dead? These were not scientific conclusions, but they fit neatly into the age's taste for melodrama. Modernize on old clues. You open your eyes and imagine a circle of modern doctors around a table, each holding the scraps of evidence left behind. Constanze's letters, eyewitness notes, the single-page death register. They don't have a body to examine, no tissue to biopsy, no blood to test, just words. And yet, they keep debating. One group argues for streptococcal infection, a strep throat gone deadly, leading to rheumatic fever and acute kidney failure. They point to the swelling in Mozart's limbs, the fever, the delirium, all symptoms that could match post-streptococcal complications. Others counter with trichinosis, again citing pork. Though critics note that symptoms described don't align with that parasite's usual progression, then there's Henoch-Schönlein purpura, a rare inflammatory disease causing rashes, kidney damage, and fever. Some doctors in the 1990s championed this explanation after poring over the notes left by Mozart's contemporaries. The fascinating thing is how much medical diagnosis, even today, relies on interpretation of incomplete records. A swollen face. Was it edema from kidney failure? Or just dehydration from fever? A rash. Was it purpura or one of the countless skin irritations of the 18th century? Each new diagnosis tells us as much about the era of the doctors proposing it as it does about Mozart himself. The 19th century leaned toward grand, mysterious diseases. The 20th leaned on parasites and rare syndromes. The 21st likes immune disorders and post-streptococcal complications. It's like each generation rewrites Mozart's death in its own medical vocabulary. The quirky, the bizarre, and the what-ifs. Some theories verge on the theatrical. In the 1970s, one scholar even suggested mercury poisoning, not by Salieri, but as an unintended consequence of treatment. Mercury was a common ingredient in 18th century medicine, especially for treating syphilis. Did Mozart's doctors inadvertently hasten his death with toxic remedies? Others wonder whether the endless bleeding and blistering drained his strength rather than restored it. Imagine lying in bed, feverish and weak, while doctors took more blood in the belief it would balance your humors. It's enough to make you shiver. And then there's the curious speculation about Mozart's workload itself. In the weeks before his death, he was composing furiously, teaching lessons, performing concerts, and managing debts. Stress, lack of sleep, poor nutrition, all of it could have weakened his immune system. It's a very modern way of looking at it. Burnout as pathology. Some say his body simply collapsed under the weight of genius and responsibility. The quirkiest detail, one historian in the early 20th century proposed that Mozart died from military fever, spread by soldiers returning from campaign. It's unlikely, but the image is striking. The composer of Don Giovanni, undone not by rivals or poisons, but by germs brought in the boots of marching men. The debate that will never end. You realize, with a certain softness, that the debate over Mozart's death is unsolvable, and that's why it endures. Every theory reflects not just curiosity about Mozart, but a need to connect him to our own time. Each diagnosis feels like a mirror. Doctors in 1800 wanted to frame him in terms of fever and divine punishment. Doctors in 1900 wanted parasites and germs. Doctors today want immune disorders and chronic inflammation. Mozart's death is a medical Rorschach test, revealing as much about us as about him. The mainstream fact is that Mozart died of an acute illness described by his doctors as severe miliary fever, likely involving infection and swelling. The quirky detail is the theory of trichinosis from undercooked pork, an oddly earthy explanation for a celestial composer. And the open scholarly debate is whether the true cause was rheumatic fever, kidney disease, poisoning, or some yet unimagined diagnosis. As you let these voices drift away, you're left with the strange comfort that Mozart's music, not his malady, is what truly survived. His death may be forever a question mark, but his symphonies, his operas, his Requiem, those are the clearest answers he left behind. You lean back, as though centuries of speculation are pressing down on your shoulders, and imagine a candlelit study, not in 1791 Vienna, but in the sober rooms of 19th and 20th century medical historians. Papers are scattered, thick with hypotheses, and somewhere in the margins of old journals, the word rheumatism keeps showing up like an itch you can't quite scratch. It sounds mundane, almost anticlimactic. Rheumatic fever doesn't have the sinister sparkle of poison, conspiracy, or masked strangers at Mozart's door. And yet, the more doctors and scholars have peered back through the fog of time, the more this rheumatic theory insists on being heard. Tonight, you find yourself wandering through the debate, as though your slippers squeak across the wooden floors of dusty medical archives. So, let's lay the scene gently. Rheumatic fever, if you've been lucky enough not to meet it personally, usually begins with a simple infection. Think sore throat. Think swollen tonsils, redness, maybe a fever that drags at your body. In Mozart's day, these infections were everywhere, and untreated, they could spiral. The human body, in its infinite creativity, sometimes responds to infection by turning its own defenses against itself. Joints swell, the heart inflames, fluid builds, and suddenly, what seemed like a trivial sore throat becomes a ticking time bomb. You know how we sometimes joke about walking off a cold? Yeah, back then, walking it off might mean you're also quietly walking into an early grave. Mainstream fact number 1. Many modern physicians reviewing Mozart's symptoms, fever, swollen limbs, delirium, difficulty moving, say these line up neatly with acute rheumatic fever, or even its cousin, post-streptococcal kidney disease. It's not as glamorous as he was poisoned by Salieri, or the Freemasons took revenge. But sometimes, history's loudest mysteries collapse into the soft sigh of medical reality. Still, as you picture him in bed on Rauhensteingasse, swollen legs tucked under a heavy quilt, you have to ask, could rheumatic fever alone really have dragged him under so fast? Historians still argue whether the evidence truly adds up. Some say, yes, he was young, but not invincible. Rheumatic relapses could be triggered by stress, exhaustion, even by the damp Viennese winters. And Mozart, in those last months, was nothing if not exhausted. Too many nights of composing by candlelight, too many arguments, too many unpaid bills, gnawing at his stomach. In that sense, the disease fits like a sad glove. But quirky tidbit time. In the 1990s, a group of doctors got curious and dug through death registers from Vienna in 1791. And guess what they found? An unusual spike in deaths from edema. That's swelling caused by fluid retention, often a side effect of kidney inflammation. It wasn't just Mozart. Dozens of people were swelling up like soggy bread loaves that winter. So maybe it wasn't only about him. It was about a mini epidemic sweeping through the city. Imagine Vienna itself like a coughing patient, wheezing through icy streets, carrying microbes in every tavern and alleyway. Mozart wasn't uniquely cursed. He was just tragically unlucky to fall into the statistic. Now, you might be tempted to roll your eyes and say, that's it? Rheumatic fever killed Mozart? That's the big reveal after centuries of gossip? It does sound like the most boring Netflix documentary ever. But take a step closer. If rheumatic fever really was the culprit, it says something haunting about the limits of genius. Because here's a man whose mind poured out symphonies like a faucet, whose music could peel the wallpaper off reality itself. And yet, no brilliance, no fame, no burst of creative fire could shield his body from the microscopic strep bacteria hitching a ride on winter air. It's a brutal reminder that even the brightest candle can be snuffed out by the smallest draft. Doctors studying the case today point out another wrinkle. Rheumatic fever often strikes children and teenagers, and most people either die young from it or survive to adulthood with damaged hearts. So the question hovers, why would Mozart suddenly develop an acute attack at age 35? Some say he may have had earlier flare-ups that we simply don't know about. Records hint that in his youth, he often got sick during tours. Fevers that lingered suspiciously long. Maybe those were early brushstrokes of rheumatic disease painting the canvas. Others counter that the kidney disease theory makes more sense. Post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, fancy word, scarier than it sounds, where the kidneys clog and leak after infection, causing body-wide swelling, which explains his ballooning joints, the tight skin, the fever. And here comes the debate. Historians still argue whether his symptoms point more to rheumatic heart failure or kidney collapse. One group insists his heart gave out. Another claims his kidneys shut down. A third throws up their hands and mutters, why not both? You can almost imagine the scholarly conferences, PowerPoints glowing on screens, as doctors compare Mozart's 1791 notes to modern case studies. There's a peculiar irony in diagnosing someone who's been dead for over 2 centuries. The patient doesn't get better, but your career might. Meanwhile, back in Rauhensteingasse, none of these elegant theories matter to Constanze. She just sees her husband groaning under blankets, face puffed, eyes glazed. No textbook, no Latin terminology, just the panic of a wife hearing the shallow rattle of breath. For her, the mystery wasn't whether it was rheumatic fever, nephritis, or influenza. It was simply the horror of watching him slip. Medicine at the time was more about appearances than results. Doctors leaned on bloodletting, poultices, mysterious powders, and whispered Latin. But when faced with the quiet relentlessness of rheumatic inflammation, they might as well have been throwing water at a fire, already doused in oil. And if you want a slightly comic image amid the sadness, think about this. One recommended 18th century remedy for rheumatism involved wrapping the patient in freshly slaughtered animal skins, still warm from the body heat of the beast. Imagine poor Mozart, feverish and swollen, and a doctor saying, "Hold on, let's just roll him up like a burrito in cowhide. That should do the trick." Yeah, science wasn't quite ready yet. You laugh, because if you don't, you'll cry. The rheumatic theory matters though, because it grounds the story. Instead of sinister hands sprinkling poison into his wine, it paints a quieter tragedy. A man crushed by his own body, betrayed by infections invisible to the naked eye. There's something strangely more chilling about that. At least with poison, you can blame someone. With rheumatism, the villain is everywhere and nowhere, floating in the air you breathe. And here's the kicker. Modern antibiotics would have cleared Mozart's infection in a week. A cheap prescription, some rest, maybe some soup, and he could have lived to write another 20 years of masterpieces. Imagine symphonies we never heard, operas unwritten, a requiem completed not in fragments, but in full thunder. Instead, a microscopic chain of bacteria cut the music short. Sometimes, history hinges not on conspiracies, but on the absence of penicillin. You close your eyes for a moment, picturing Mozart in his final days. Weak but restless, swollen but still trying to dictate passages of the Requiem. His lips whispering melodies, even as his body betrayed him. If rheumatic fever was indeed the cause, then it wasn't murder that silenced him. It was nature's indifferent shrug. And in some ways, that's the harshest verdict of all. You're lying there again in that creaky 18th century bed, blankets pulled up to your chin, Vienna's winter wind pressing against the shuttered windows, and you can almost hear the faint echo of sleigh bells outside. The story so far has been tugging you through grief, gossip, and endless diagnoses. But now, brace yourself. We're wading even deeper into the medical swamp. Because historians, bless their ink-stained souls, never seem satisfied with one neat answer. If rheumatic fever might have been Mozart's undoing, as some argued, others tossed in their own exotic guesses, like chefs seasoning a stew, each one stranger, each one trying to capture the elusive truth behind the maestro's early death. And honestly, some of these theories feel less like medicine and more like the 18th century version of internet comment sections. Half earnest, half outlandish. One camp looked to the kidneys, those quiet, bean-shaped organs, tucked away like forgotten violin cases. Maybe it was a nephritic condition, they proposed. Mozart had been swollen after all, his limbs puffing up, his face looking rounder. Edema, they whispered knowingly. A sure sign the kidneys had tapped out. You picture poor Mozart as a human water balloon, drifting toward his final days, while doctors tried leaching him to drain the fluids. That was actual medical practice then. Stick a leech on, hope for the best, and maybe the patient won't scream too loudly. The irony, of course, is that leeches probably made him weaker instead of helping. Historians still argue whether the swelling was from kidney failure, from infection, or just from an exhausted body giving up. Others thought maybe the heart itself was the culprit. Endocarditis, an infection of the inner lining of the heart, was tossed around. It fits some of the symptoms: fever, weakness, joint pain, and it had a poetic punch, didn't it? The heart of music dying because the heart of the man failed. But of course, there's no real autopsy, no preserved tissue, just scraps of witness notes. It's like trying to guess what's in a locked box by sniffing the air around it. You lean closer to the locked lid, but all you smell is 1791 Vienna stew, cabbage, horses, and maybe a hint of chimney soot. Then there was the ever-popular infection by pus. I kid you not, a whole set of doctors, decades later, looked at descriptions of Mozart's fever, his headaches, and his delirium, and said, "Yep, sounds like streptococcal sepsis." That's doctor speak for bacteria throwing a house party in the bloodstream. And if you've ever had strep throat, just imagine it unchecked, raging through your veins, multiplying like rabbits at a carrot festival. Mozart may have been young, but antibiotics didn't exist yet. A throat infection, a skin wound, even a rotten tooth could spread like wildfire. You probably wouldn't survive that either. Still, some scholars went further afield. One theory, oddly modern in its hindsight, proposed mercury poisoning. Remember that medicine chest from earlier, the one filled with tinctures and remedies? Mercury was everywhere back then, a go-to cure for syphilis, among other things. Did Mozart have syphilis? Well, let's just say no hard evidence proves it, but historians love dangling the possibility. The rumor mill points to his lively lifestyle, his flirtations, his travels. Mercury, whether swallowed in liquid form or rubbed in ointments, was supposed to cure you. In reality, it often poisoned you slowly, leaving tremors, madness, and eventually, organ failure. Imagine Mozart trembling at his keyboard, not from passion, but from the slow burn of medicine gone wrong. Historians still argue whether this is plausible or just gossip with a pseudo-scientific twist. And then, the truly oddball ideas. Some suggested trichinosis, a parasite from undercooked pork. Picture it, Mozart sitting at dinner, slicing into sausages, maybe humming a melody between bites, and inside those innocent bites lurked tiny worms waiting to invade his muscles. The symptoms fit: fever, swelling, muscle pain. There's even a record of him eating pork just before his illness worsened. But again, without tissue samples, no one can check. It's one of those cases where medical hindsight makes you slap your forehead. It could have been worms. But really, that diagnosis might be stretching a sausage link too far. Quirkier still, One historian floated the idea of Mozart dying from a head cold turned catastrophic. I know, it sounds like your grandma's warning. Bundle up, or you'll catch your death of cold. In the 18th century, though, untreated respiratory infections could spiral quickly. Pneumonia, pleurisy, bronchitis, all serious without antibiotics. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some Viennese households treated chest infections by strapping frogs to the body, believing the amphibians would draw out the illness. No evidence Constanze ever did this, thankfully. Imagine Mozart covered in croaking, wriggling frogs while trying to conduct from bed. That's not exactly the glorious portrait of genius we like to frame. The academic debates over these odd diagnoses still swirl. Was it a kidney failure, domino effect? A parasite piggybacking on dinner? Mercury dripping from cures? Or just a strep infection that spiraled out of control? Each theory comes with advocates waving notes and others rolling their eyes. You can almost see them huddled in library corners, arguing whether Mozart was undone by medicine, microbes, or meat. Meanwhile, you, the listener, sink deeper into your pillow, realizing that Mozart's tragedy is less about one clean cause and more about the fragility of life before modern science. Whatever killed him, it wasn't necessarily fate or poison or cosmic punishment. It was the ordinary dangers of being human in a time when even a simple sore throat could write your obituary. Still, the mystery clings to the story like damp wool, because the idea of genius, snuffed out without warning, always leaves us hungry for a reason. And sometimes, perhaps, no diagnosis will ever quite satisfy. You're tucked in again, the candlelight flickering low, and tonight's chapter drifts, not through hospital wards or physician's notes, but through something much more seductive. How art itself sculpted the story of Mozart's death. Because here's the thing, you can argue about rheumatic fever, worms, or mercury all you like. But for most of the world, the facts barely matter. What lingers is the image, the fragile genius at his desk, quill scratching furiously at the Requiem as shadows deepen, his health collapsing with every note, and fate pressing close. That image, painted, staged, filmed, became more powerful than any doctor's report. Art didn't just retell Mozart's final days. It invented them. Take the Requiem, for starters. The unfinished masterpiece is like the soundtrack to his own death, and people couldn't resist hearing it that way. After all, how cinematic is it that his last work was a mass for the dead? Never mind that plenty of composers worked on funeral music in their lifetimes. Mozart's timing seemed cosmic. Almost immediately after his burial, writers described him feverishly dictating the score from bed, his voice weak but insistent, as if he were writing his own farewell. Constanze herself encouraged these stories, partly to enhance the drama, partly to keep public interest in the unfinished work and its profits. A little widow's marketing genius, if you will. And with each retelling, the myth deepened. The deathbed composer, haunted by the sound of his own Requiem. Visual artists quickly joined in. Early portraits showed Mozart pale, thin, almost saintly, nothing like the plump, joking man friends had remembered just months earlier. Painters brushed away the swollen limbs, the messy realities, and instead framed him like a martyr to music. Quirky detail. One lithograph from the early 19th century shows him literally haloed in light, as though he'd been canonized not by the church, but by the concert hall. Art had smoothed the tragedy into a story of sublime sacrifice. And then came the dramatists. By the mid-1800s, Mozart's deathbed was already a theatrical set piece. Playwrights staged him, coughing out final notes, while a mysterious masked commissioner lingered in the wings, the same shadowy figure who ordered the Requiem in real life. The commissioner's identity was ordinary, an eccentric count who loved funeral music. But on stage, it became sinister. Was this death itself disguised and watching the composer crumble? Was it Salieri, his rival, come to gloat? Audiences thrilled to the mystery. The humdrum fact had been transformed into a Gothic legend. This myth-making reached its glittering, operatic peak in the 20th century with Amadeus. First, a play in 1979, then the 1984 film that swept the Oscars. It cemented the story for millions. There's Mozart, wild laugh echoing, genius pouring out of him unchecked. And there's Salieri, jealous and calculating, feeding him the notes of the Requiem at his bedside, watching him collapse. Historically inaccurate, absolutely irresistible, even more so. For most of the modern public, Amadeus became reality. The film gave the world a Mozart who died mid-composition, poisoned not by bacteria, but by envy itself. That's how powerful art can be. It rewrote history into tragedy with a capital T. Even musicologists who know better sometimes slip into the drama. Listen to recordings of the Requiem today, and you'll hear conductors lean into the story, tempo stretched, dynamics sharpened, as if they too want to wring every ounce of myth from the notes. You can't just play the Requiem. You have to perform Mozart's last breath. The legend has seeped into the music itself. And here's the quirky tidbit for this section. In 1830, a stage play in Paris literally ended with actors carrying a coffin labeled Mozart onto the stage while the Requiem thundered. Audience members wept, convinced they were witnessing a ritual as much as a drama. The line between art and history blurred so completely that, for many, the performance became memory. Of course, historians grumble about this. They want the messy details, the swollen joints, the probable strep infection, the grieving widow haggling with copyists. But the public prefers art, because art gives us a narrative we can hold on to, a brilliant light, extinguished too soon, leaving behind a masterpiece that feels like a prophecy. That's the paradox. You don't need truth to shape memory. You need a story. So tonight, as you listen, you might picture the deathbed scene, not as it really was, but as art told us it must have been. The candle guttering, the unfinished score trembling in the composer's hand, and silence descending at the final bar he never wrote. Whether or not it happened that way almost doesn't matter. The image, the myth, the art, that's what survives. You close your eyes, and for a moment, imagine it. A grave dug, hastily in frozen December soil, a plain wooden coffin, no pomp, no lasting marker. Mozart's body disappears into the earth, like a whisper, Vienna hurrying on with its business. If the story ended there, with a vanished corpse and unanswered questions, you'd think the world might forget him. After all, composers died all the time, and many slipped into obscurity after their funerals. But not this one, because Mozart's real monument wasn't marble or bronze. It was sound, and sound, floating, repeatable, impossible to bury, would carry him forward long after the man himself was gone. At first, though, it wasn't obvious. In the 1790s, plenty of people still thought of him as a clever entertainer, a little too frivolous at times, certainly not a titan. Haydn was the grand master, Beethoven, the promising young lion. Mozart? He was the one who left debts and unfinished drafts. His widow Constanze had to scramble to keep his name alive, staging benefit concerts, pushing the Requiem into the spotlight, reminding people that this wasn't just another dead composer. It was genius, cut short. And slowly, through those efforts, the tide began to turn. By the mid-19th century, Europe had started to build its pantheon of immortal composers, and Mozart rose higher with each decade. His operas, once thought too playful, revealed layers of emotional depth that critics finally recognized. Don Giovanni became the very model of a serious opera. The symphonies, especially the last three, written in the blazing summer of 1788, were held up as proof of mathematical perfection, married to sheer joy. The piano concertos became scripture for any serious performer. But it was more than analysis or scholarship. His music spread like a secret code across the world, adaptable to every listener. To some, it sounded like divine clarity. To others, like a child's laughter captured in notes. To still others, like the voice of tragedy wrapped in beauty. Unlike many composers whose reputations wax and wane, Mozart seemed to gather momentum with each new century. Here's a quirky detail for you. In the 19th century, doctors actually prescribed Mozart, literally. Some physicians claimed his music could calm nerves, improve digestion, even help with insomnia. Long before the famous Mozart effect, fad of the 1990s, people thought his melodies carried something medicinal. Maybe it wasn't science, but patients swore they felt better when serenaded by his symphonies. You almost wonder if Mozart himself, plagued by illness, would have laughed at the irony. Meanwhile, his life story was polished into legend. The pauper's grave, the jealous rival, the deathbed requiem, all those myths became inseparable from the music. And far from diminishing it, the drama only amplified its glow. People weren't just listening to notes. They were communing with a fallen genius. Each aria, each phrase carried a shadow of the tragedy. By the 20th century, he wasn't just a composer anymore. He was a brand. His face appeared on chocolates, stamps, porcelain figurines. Salzburg became a pilgrimage site, its souvenir shops bursting with Mozart Kugeln, those chocolate marzipan balls wrapped in foil printed with his portrait. Some critics grumbled about the commercialization, but in its own way, that too showed how much he had outlived his time. 2 centuries earlier, he had worried about money for bread and rent. Now he was an economy unto himself, and still, the music kept shimmering. Eine kleine Nachtmusik played in hotel lobbies and weddings. The Requiem thundered in concert halls. Tiny piano students fumbled through Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, a melody Mozart had once toyed with in variations. His voice filtered into daily life, high and low, sacred and ordinary. The mainstream fact here is undeniable. Mozart's music has never fallen out of the repertoire. Every major orchestra in the world programs him. Every opera house cycles through The Marriage of Figaro and The Magic Flute. His notes are permanent fixtures, as if carved not in stone, but in the air itself. And yet, his afterlife raises a quiet question. Did death make him greater? Would Mozart have reached such heights of myth if he had lived to 70, writing more operas, perhaps going out of fashion like others did? There's a debate among scholars. Was his early death the tragedy that sealed his immortality? Or would he have risen anyway by sheer force of brilliance? No one can answer, but it's a riddle that lingers, like a chord unresolved. So as the night deepens, think of this: the man vanished. The body, the coffin, the marker, gone. But the music stayed and multiplied and grew larger than the life that created it. When you listen to him now, in a quiet room or through a vast orchestra, you're hearing proof that death could not silence him. The grave swallowed Mozart the man, but it never even touched Mozart the sound. You've wandered through Mozart's life and death, the music, the medicine, the myths. You've stood in the chilly Vienna air on that December morning. You've peeked at autopsy notes, followed poison rumors, and watched art weave a cloak of legend around him. And now, as the story winds down, you're left with one haunting truth. Not everything fits together. Some things will always remain unanswered. Take the grave, for instance. We don't know precisely where Mozart lies. In St. Mark's Cemetery, somewhere under grass and gravel, there's a patch of ground that might hold his bones, or maybe not. When his widow went looking years later, the gravedigger pointed vaguely, but by then, several bodies had been shifted and mixed. The great genius may have been reduced to dust, mingled with strangers. His identity dissolved into anonymity. It's almost unthinkable. Yet it happened. Then there's the cause of death: rheumatic fever, kidney failure, a strep infection, or some rare autoimmune disorder no one in the 1790s could have named. Each theory carries weight. Each has holes. The fevers, the swelling, the rash. They fit some diagnoses, not others. His sudden decline at just 35 has puzzled physicians for over 2 centuries. If modern medicine could take a blood test, we might know in an hour, but no samples survive. And so the debate goes on, each camp arguing, no camp victorious. And what about the darker rumors? The poison, the jealous rival, the Freemason curse? Most scholars dismiss them, but they persist like shadows at the edge of a candle flame. Was Salieri truly haunted by guilt, or just slandered by later writers? Did the unfinished Requiem really weigh on Mozart with dread, or was that story embroidered afterward? These questions blur fact and fiction, but they refuse to vanish entirely. Even his legacy is wrapped in paradox. He was adored by some in his lifetime, dismissed by others, and only crowned as immortal decades later. Would he have been shocked to know how famous he became? Would he have laughed to see his face on chocolate wrappers, or frowned at the idea of being commodified? We can't ask him. The answers lie locked in the silence of history. The mainstream fact, the one everyone agrees on, is this: Mozart died young, far too young, leaving masterpieces behind. But the quirky twist is how much mystery has clung to him compared to other composers. Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert all died too, but their stories feel clearer, their graves marked, their illnesses more easily catalogued. With Mozart, it's as if the universe itself conspired to leave gaps, daring us to fill them with imagination. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps if every puzzle were solved, if every note of his life had a neat explanation, he would feel more human, less mythic. Instead, we're left with riddles, a vanished body, a blurred diagnosis, a legend amplified by mystery. It's frustrating, yes, but it also ensures Mozart will always remain a story to be told, again and again. So as you sit here, at the close of this long tale, ask yourself, is it the certainty or the uncertainty that keeps him alive in our minds? The music endures, yes, but so does the curiosity. The unanswered questions are like little silences between the notes, giving shape to the whole. And maybe that is Mozart's final gift, that even in death, even in mystery, he composes a kind of unfinished symphony, one in which we are all still listening. The grave is gone. The diagnosis is lost. The man is dust. But the questions, those remain. So now, as the last echoes of this story fade, let yourself drift back from Vienna's cold streets, away from candlelit rooms, and into the quiet of your own space. You've walked through mystery, through medicine, through rumor and song. You've seen Mozart not only as a genius, but also as a fragile, very human figure, someone who laughed, who suffered, who worked too hard, and who left far too soon. And yet, here you are, still listening, more than 2 centuries later. That is the power of memory. That is the strange immortality of music. The unanswered questions, the missing grave, the uncertain cause of death, the tangled legends become like shadows in a moonlit garden. Not threatening, not frightening, just part of the landscape. Soft, shifting, incomplete. Take a deep breath now. Let it out slowly. Imagine the last notes of a symphony hanging in the air, the silence afterward holding you gently like a blanket. You don't need to solve the riddles tonight. You don't need every detail to line up neatly. History rarely does. And that's all right. Feel your shoulders release. Feel your eyelids grow heavier. The story has brought you here, but the night is carrying you further into your own rest. Think of Mozart's music as a kind of lullaby, not loud, not dramatic, but soft, like the slow middle movement of a piano concerto, where every note seems to breathe. You've reached the end of the tale, but not the end of the music. The questions remain, the legends remain, and perhaps tomorrow you'll wonder about them again. But for now, you can set them down. They'll wait. The night asks only that you rest. So close your eyes. Let the silence after the story cradle you, and let the mysteries remain unsolved, just as Mozart left his Requiem unfinished. A fragment, but a beautiful one. Good night. Sleep deeply, and may your dreams carry you softly, like music fading into peace. Sweet dreams.